Iran's foreign minister declared that his country's military doctrine is an eye for an eye. The Secretary of State of the United States responded with 4 words that change the rules of engagement for the rest of this conflict. A head for an eye. Marco Rubio did not match Araghchi's formulation. He raised it. He did not say proportional. He did not say equivalent. He said, head for an eye. Whatever Iran spends on an attack, the American answer costs more. Whatever scale Iran chooses for its retaliation, the American response does not scale down to match it. It scales up. This is the Secretary of State of the United States going on record in public in the most explicit possible terms, declaring that the rules of engagement for this conflict have permanently shifted from tit for tat to a doctrine of deliberate, disproportionate, asymmetric consequence. The tit for tat framework is gone. What replaced it is the statement that every Iranian military commander, every IRGC general calculating what to authorize and what to hold back, needs to internalize before they make the next targeting decision. The American answer will cost more, always. Araghchi's eye for an eye declaration was supposed to establish deterrence, to communicate that Iranian retaliation would be precisely calibrated to match American strikes, creating an equilibrium in which the cost of escalation is symmetric and therefore stabilizing. Rubio's response destroyed that equilibrium in a single sentence. By publicly committing to a response that is asymmetric by design, that deliberately exceeds the scale of whatever Iran does, that does not reduce to match Iranian restraint, the United States has removed from Iran's strategic calculation the option of calculated proportional retaliation as a means of influencing American behavior. If the American response will always be larger, regardless of what Iran does, the mathematics of Iranian deterrence through graduated escalation collapse entirely. You cannot stabilize a conflict through proportional retaliation when the other side has announced it will not be proportional. But the Rubio doctrine is not even the most significant development of the last 36 hours, because while the Secretary of State was publicly rewriting the rules of engagement, Trump confirmed to Axios that the United States is close to a final decision on a strike described as bigger than anything launched against Iran so far. 13 consecutive nights of CENTCOM strikes, 170 targets in the first 48 hours. Power plants struck, bridges destroyed, nuclear facilities bombed, a submarine pen at Bandar Abbas destroyed by autonomous sea drones in the first confirmed combat use of that system. The most expansive sustained air campaign against an adversary's military infrastructure in recent American history, and the decision being described as close is for something bigger than all of that. Not incrementally bigger. Bigger than anything launched against Iran so far. That is not a description of the 14th night in a row of the established operational pattern. That is a description of a qualitatively different strike package. One that addresses targets that have not yet been addressed. One that uses platforms and munitions that have been held in reserve. One that produces an operational outcome that changes the strategic equation in a way that 13 nights of the existing campaign could not. But let us back all the way up, because to understand what the military buildup currently converging on the Middle East actually represents, and why the combination of the Rubio doctrine, the Axios strike confirmation, and the logistics footprint becoming visible across multiple operating locations tells a specific and coherent story, you need to understand what a buildup at this scale looks like operationally and what it takes to move before anything kinetic happens. B-2 Spirit stealth bombers are running missions at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. The aircraft that can fly round trip to Iran from American soil without requiring forward basing in the theater. The only aircraft in the world cleared to carry the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, the 30,000-pound bunker buster specifically designed for Pickaxe Mountain and the category of hardened underground nuclear facility it represents, are not sitting idle. They are running missions. Operations tempo at Whiteman is elevated. That is not incidental maintenance activity. That is crew readiness generation for an operation that the Commander-in-Chief has said is close to final authorization. B-1B Lancers at RAF Fairford in England are locked and loaded. That phrasing from the operational picture is precise and deliberate. Locked and loaded means the payload configuration is already aboard, the aircraft are ready to execute, and the remaining variable is the order. The B-1B at Fairford likely carries bunker buster payloads, 5,000-pound precision penetrating weapons that the supersonic bomber can deliver against hardened underground targets with the kind of terminal precision that makes mountain granite a structural challenge rather than an absolute barrier. Engines at Fairford are warm. The aircraft are not waiting on payload configuration. They are waiting on one phone call from the Commander-in-Chief. F-16CJ Wild Weasels, 2 squadrons, have flown from Spangdahlem Air Base in Germany and from bases in the continental United States toward the Gulf Theater. 2 squadrons. The dedicated suppression of enemy air defense aircraft that makes everything else possible. The Wild Weasels AN ASQ-213 harm targeting system passively hunts for Iranian radar emissions without requiring the aircraft to transmit any signal of its own, It finds radars by listening to what they broadcast, rather than by broadcasting itself. When an Iranian radar illuminates, the system identifies its frequency, location, and emission pattern, and hands targeting data to the AGM-88 HARM anti-radiation missile before the Iranian radar operator has any indication the targeting sequence has begun. The HARM follows the radar beam back to its source. The radar operator does not know he has been found until the moment the missile arrives. 2 full squadrons of these aircraft being positioned in theater simultaneously with the B-2s running in Missouri and the B-1s warmed at Fairford is not a coincidence of operational scheduling. It is the CED architecture, suppression of enemy air defense, for a strike package that will require extensive air defense corridor clearing before the primary mission platforms can operate. KC-135 tankers are stacked across Europe in a configuration described as creating an airlift bridge to the region. The tanker bridge is the logistical backbone that makes everything else possible over the distances involved. A round-trip B-2 mission from Missouri to Iran and back is 30-plus hours of flight time requiring multiple aerial refueling cycles over the Atlantic and Indian Ocean. The Wild Weasels, transiting from Germany to theater, require tanker support. The F-35s, providing top cover over the strike package, require tanker support. Nothing in this strike architecture operates without the tanker fleet providing continuous fuel at altitude across the full geographic span of the operation. The visible tanker positioning across European airspace, stacked in significant numbers running around the clock, is not routine logistics. It is the fuel supply chain of an imminent large-scale operation being moved into position. C-17, Globemaster IIIs, and C-5 Galaxy cargo aircraft are running around the clock carrying time-critical equipment that cannot wait for sea lift. The bulk of heavy equipment moves by sea, cargo ships crossing the ocean at 25 knots, taking weeks to complete the transit. What rides the airlift bridge is what cannot wait. Maintenance equipment, specialized munitions that cannot tolerate weeks of sea transit, personnel with specific skills required for the mission configuration that is being built. The airlift running around the clock alongside the tanker bridge stacking across Europe is the visible logistics of weeks of choreography collapsing into final execution position. This is not a subtle move. It is designed not to be subtle. Part of the strategic function of a visible buildup at this scale is communication to Iran, to Iran's partners, to the international community watching from the outside, that the decision calculus has changed and that the window for any negotiated alternative is narrowing at the pace of the aircraft arriving in theater. Every Wild Weasel that lands at a Gulf base is an increment of the pressure that is supposed to produce either a diplomatic breakthrough or a military resolution. Iran is watching the buildup. Iran is counting the aircraft. Iran has been asking for a 10-day ceasefire to reconstitute. That request is the answer to what Iran thinks the buildup means. The excavator problem is the tactical detail that explains both the 10-day ceasefire request and why it will not be granted in the current strategic context. 13 nights of CENTCOM strikes have produced documentation of something that the strike footage makes visible if you look specifically for it. Excavators being struck. Not accidentally, deliberately, targeted specifically. An excavator is not a weapon system in the conventional sense. It is a machine used to move dirt and debris. And the reason CENTCOM is targeting excavators in Iran specifically is that Iran has developed a tactical pattern for surviving the strike campaign that uses exactly those machines. American strikes hit underground missile storage facilities, the mountain complexes that house the ballistic missile inventory, producing damage to the entrance infrastructure, debris from collapsed tunnel sections, and structural disruption to the access routes the facility depends on. Iranian forces then deploy excavators to clear the debris, remove the collapsed material, and reopen the access routes. In a matter of hours or days, the facility that was struck has its access restored. A ballistic missile launcher is wheeled out from the interior, repositioned at a launch point, and fired. The launcher returns to the mountain. The excavators go back to work. Nothing from the outside has permanently changed. The targeting of excavators is CENTCOM's answer to this reconstitution cycle. If the machines that restore access to struck facilities are destroyed at the same time as the facilities themselves, the reconstitution timeline extends from hours to weeks or months. Without excavators, the collapsed entrance cannot be efficiently cleared. Without efficient clearance, the launcher cannot be extracted for the next strike. The excavators are the enablers of the reconstitution that makes each cycle of strikes temporary rather than permanent. Destroying them is the tactical answer to the IRGC's mountain and machinery survival strategy. And Iran wants a 10-day ceasefire, specifically because 10 days without strikes is 10 days of excavator-enabled reconstitution that puts the missile inventory back into operational position. The ceasefire request is not a diplomatic gesture. It is a reconstitution request. Now let us establish the full operational picture of what has been happening over the past 36 hours and the confirmed specific numbers and named developments that ground the analysis. CENTCOM executed its 13th consecutive night of strikes against Iranian military targets, initiating at 6:45 p.m. Eastern Time. The target list for Night 13 expanded beyond the established pattern of the preceding 12 nights in a specific way. Iranian military command centers and communication networks joined the established target categories of drone storage, coastal surveillance, and maritime sites. The expansion of the target set to command centers and communications networks represents the same escalatory logic applied by the strike that first hit IRGC headquarters in Tehran several nights earlier. You have destroyed the instruments. Now you're destroying the authority and coordination infrastructure that would allow new instruments to be effectively employed even if they are somehow reconstituted. Command centers direct the military. Communications networks enable the coordination that command centers require. Striking both simultaneously is the approach to eliminating not just Iran's current military capability, but its capacity to generate coherent military direction even from whatever distributed command architecture survives. Trump announced that $2 billion in Iranian frozen money held by the United States will be paid to commercial shipping companies whose vessels were destroyed by IRGC attacks. $2 billion. Not as a fine against Iran, as compensation to the specific companies whose ships were targeted and blown up. This is the financial accountability dimension of the campaign being made concrete and specific. The money that Iran was keeping accessible through the financial system is being converted into reparations for the civilian shipping industry that Iran deliberately targeted. The financial blow is pointed directly at the IRGC's conduct and names the specific victims that the conduct produced. It is also a signal to the global shipping industry that the American government is willing to compensate commercial operators for damages Iran inflicts on them in the Strait. A signal that stabilizes the commercial shipping calculus around continuing to use the Strait even under IRGC threat by establishing that American backing covers the downside risk of that choice. The Houthi threat to blockade the Bab el-Mandeb Strait is Iran calling in its most geographically significant remaining proxy asset. The Bab el-Mandeb connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, is the choke point through which vessels transit after passing through the Suez Canal from the Mediterranean toward Asia, and is the maritime passage that the global shipping industry uses to route Asia-Europe trade when the Cape of Good Hope alternative is assessed as too expensive in time and fuel. If the Houthis close Bab el-Mandeb simultaneously with the IRGC restricting Hormuz, both major maritime corridors connecting the world's most important oil-producing region to global markets are contested simultaneously. The shipping disruption created by both closures in the same window would produce a supply disruption without modern precedent. Trump's warning that any future Houthi attack on shipping will be held directly against Iran, with major military punishment as the consequence, is the deterrence architecture being constructed against exactly this scenario. Iran is responsible for what Iran's proxies do. The Houthis threatening Bab el-Mandeb triggers consequences against the entity directing them. The IRGC's formal naming of RAF Fairford as a legitimate target and making it a promise represents the most explicit threat to NATO infrastructure that the current conflict has produced. Fairford is where the B-1B Lancers that are warmed and ready are based. It is where the B-52H Stratofortresses preparing for standoff cruise missile operations have been training. It is an American-operated base on British soil, which means any Iranian attack against it is simultaneously an attack on the United States and on the United Kingdom, a NATO member state. The UK's statement that it is ready to defend itself around the clock is the appropriate institutional response to a threat against its territory. The strategic significance of the IRGC's Fairford threat is not that the IRGC has a credible mechanism to execute it. The distances and the available Iranian missile inventory after 13 nights of strikes make a successful attack on Fairford extraordinarily difficult. The significance is that the IRGC is now formally threatening NATO infrastructure. That crosses a threshold in the political and institutional framework of the conflict that had not previously been crossed. Now let us address the three simultaneous pressure tracks as they stand at this specific moment, because the buildup visible across multiple operating locations has changed the character of each track in ways specific to this operational phase. The military track has entered its most explicit pre-strike positioning phase since the campaign began. 13 consecutive nights have established the operational baseline. The now visible buildup, B-2s in Missouri, B-1s at Fairford, F-16CJs in theater, tankers bridging across Europe, airlift running around the clock, is the preparation for the strike that Trump's Axios confirmation described as bigger than anything launched against Iran so far. The F-16CJ Wild Weasels' role in that strike is to clear the air defense corridor that the B-2 requires to reach Pickaxe Mountain and the hardened underground nuclear infrastructure that has not yet been the primary strike mission. The Wild Weasel goes first. The harm finds the radars. The corridor opens. The B-2 follows with the GBU-57. Whatever is at the end of that corridor does not survive the outcome. This is the strike package that Rubio's head for an eye doctrine has created the political and strategic authorization for. The financial track has been strengthened by the $95 billion that Congress authorized specifically to fund this war. Iran's strategic bet has always been outlasting American political will, waiting for domestic political resistance in the United States to force a de-escalation that military pressure cannot achieve. The $95 billion authorization is the legislative answer to that bet. It is Congress telling Iran that the financial runway for this campaign is not constrained by existing budget allocations that might exhaust themselves if the conflict extends. War Powers resolutions passed the House 214 to 208, a narrow margin in a closely divided chamber, but died in the Senate 49 to 47. The Trump administration has the funding and the institutional backing to sustain this campaign for as long as the operational objectives require. Iran's outlasting strategy is being explicitly defeated not just by military pressure, but by the political and financial framework the American government has built around the campaign. The intelligence and superpower track is defined by the confirmation that Russia is helping Iran target American troops. This is the escalation threshold that moves the conflict from a bilateral U.S.-Iran confrontation into something with superpower dimensions that require response calculus beyond the Iran-specific framework. Russia's motivation is transparent. Every American resource committed to Iran is a resource not committed to supporting Ukraine. If Russia can extend the Iran conflict, drag it out, increase its cost, and force the Trump administration to keep its military focus in the Middle East, it reduces the American bandwidth for the Ukrainian theater, where Russian strategic interests are more directly engaged. The intelligence provision to Iran, the satellite imagery and targeting data that improved Iranian missile accuracy at Jordan, is Russia's instrument for extending the conflict while maintaining plausible deniability about direct military participation. The honest strategic assessment of Iran's position is the one that its own strategic bet reveals. Iran is not trying to win this conflict militarily. It is trying to survive it politically, to outlast American attention, political will, and financial commitment long enough for some combination of domestic American political pressure, international diplomatic intervention, or Iranian reconstitution capability to produce a ceasefire that the regime can survive and eventually recover from. This bet is historically not an unreasonable one. American political attention has proven limited in previous Middle Eastern confrontations, and Iranian strategic patience has outlasted American administrations before. What is different this time is the specific combination of factors. $95 billion authorized specifically for this campaign, a Senate that rejected the War Powers resolution, a commander-in-chief who has named targets publicly and whose stated doctrine is Iran will never have a nuke, and a military buildup that is generating the strike architecture for something bigger than anything that has come before. The structural risk at the center of the current moment is the one that all of the military buildup is designed to foreclose. The possibility that a 10-day ceasefire granted to Iran produces a reconstitution cycle that makes the next phase of conflict more costly than the current one. The excavator is going to work on struck missile bunkers, the Russian air defense hardware arriving through whatever supply routes remain open, the Houthi network being activated to threaten Bab el-Mandeb. Each of these is a mechanism through which Iranian strategic patience could produce the outcome it is betting on, a pause that becomes a respite, that becomes a recovery. The Wild Weasels landing in theater and the B-2s running in Missouri are the answer to that risk. The biggest strike in the conflict's history, being described as close to final authorization, is the answer to the excavator problem, to the reconstitution cycle, to the Houthi Bab el-Mandeb threat, and to the Russian targeting assistance. Not a proportional response to any one of those things, a disproportionate response to all of them simultaneously. A head for an eye. Arachi announced eye for an eye as Iran's doctrine. Rubio answered with head for an eye. 2 squadrons of Wild Weasels are in theater. The B-2s are running at Whiteman. The B-1s at Fairford are locked, loaded, and waiting. The tanker bridge is stacked across Europe. The airlift is running around the clock. And the commander-in-chief told Axios the decision is close. Whatever Iran expected when Arachi announced his doctrine, it was not the answer it received. And whatever the answer to the biggest strike in the conflict's history looks like when it is authorized, it will not be calibrated to match what Iran announced. It will be calibrated to exceed it. That is the Rubio doctrine. That is what a head for an eye means when the aircraft making the argument carry 30,000-pound bombs, and the targets they are pointed at have been named by the President of the United States on national radio. Iran started an escalator and got surprised when it kept moving. The escalator has not reached its top floor. The B-2s in Missouri are the answer to where it goes from here.